Hi, Eric here with 30x40 Design Workshop. Today I want to do a deep dive into the material selection process for the studio that we've been talking about. This is the next video in the multi-part video series. If you haven't seen the previous ones, you should go back to those and sort of get brought up to speed on where we're at. So selecting materials, when an architect selects a material palette for a project, they are looking to help tell the story of the project through the materials. Now they can either supplement the story, or they can actually be the whole story. And there are certain architects who really rely heavily on material palette to do that. For our project, what I'd like to do is sort of start with an inspirational board that's more abstract than anything else. And I think these images, which I've taken sort of around here and other places, sort of help to tell that bigger story, I think, of what we've been talking about. The top row here are ideas about texture. And this is actually a moth that's on the existing house now. So this tells me something about how I want this to feel, really subtle contrasts of texture. This speaks to not only texture, but it speaks to the landscape, some ideas about sort of controlling nature, but then also this seasonality, this sort of leaf that's fallen on, this really ordered sort of structure, speaks to the informal, the sort of wabi-sabi in the project. This image says, you know, that this building is not just about connecting back to the sort of site laterally, but also vertically up to the sky. And there's multi-dimensional parts of this project. This building is meant to be a lens for the seasons and sort of view different aspects of the site. These images really speak to seasonality sort of more than these. Leaves changing, the light changing, shadows getting longer. All of these things, when I look at them, I start to be reminded of this bigger concept, which is the building is this lens for the seasons. So how can we take these sort of more abstract images and turn them into a material palette idea here? And I'll show you kind of how I do that. So I like to have these images around when I'm selecting the materials. And then what I do is typically go to Pinterest or Houzz and I develop an idea book or a pin board. And I really like Pinterest a lot for this because it's sort of a great visual way to curate all of these ideas. And actually they have this sort of suggestion process along the way. As you're pinning things, you're being sort of delivered other pins which are similar to that, which may inspire other ideas. Now, what happens a lot of times with these idea books or pin boards is you end up with many, many images on them. And so here I might have 50 images or so. And the important thing is, and I can see thematic ties between the images, ideas about color and expression of sort of construction technique, tectonics, smooth versus rough, you know, an attitude toward nature. But what happens a lot of times is we get so many images here that it's hard to really find the thread that ties them together. So what I ask clients to do typically is to limit to do this as a first exercise, a first pass, but then limit the idea book or the pin board to just a couple of pins, 10 at most. And so I can go through this and sort of talk about, you know, which pins resonate most with me. But the important thing is when we look at all these images that we've gathered, to find the real ideas in there that are really driving the project forward. And for me, this is one of those images. And it's not about quoting the image. It's not about saying, well, I want this exact color here, or this exact light fixture, or this exact wood floor. It's more about drawing inspiration from the ideas that are at work in each image. Okay, so we have our inspirational images, we have our Pinterest images here collected on our board, and we're going to keep these on the work surface as we continue to develop the material palette. As we spoke about last time, we have a couple of ideas that are at work here. We want to take those inspirational images and really overlay them on the main concepts for the building. And that was the idea that this is a barn. It's a sort of workshop. It's maybe a more industrial place where work takes place, music happens. And also that the building is acting as a lens for the seasons. So those two concepts and all of these inspirational images start to suggest to me this idea about contrasts. So there's contrast between warm and cool, contrast between light and dark, detailed areas versus smooth areas, summer and winter. All of those things can start to be informed and expressed in the material palette that we choose. So as we're looking at building systems and designing architecture, we have a couple of basic, elements that we use to create architecture. So there's the floor system, there are walls, there's a roof system, and there are, you know, interior shells, interior ideas and exterior ideas. And it's funny, as I was clearing the site this weekend in preparation for the breaking ground here, a bunch of the cedars that I cut down really express this idea pretty nicely, this idea about a sort of tougher bark exterior and a warmer interior. You can see here this piece of bark from the cedar has this sort of gray exterior, has a lot of texture, surface figure, and the interior is this nice warm color. And so as you start to develop these concepts and really think about them as you're working through a problem, they start to sort of appear in all these different ways. And this can really manifest itself as a very simple idea on this building itself. And so as we start to develop these materials, we'll look at ways that we can start to exploit these contrasts, ideas of texture and smoothness and, you know, a gray, sort of warm versus cool. Those ideas will start to show themselves in our more refined material palette here. So let's think about barns in terms of a floor system. Floor system for this particular project, I think the one that makes the most sense is concrete. So we're going to do a very simple foundation here. It's going to be a slab on grade. It's going to be a frost protected slab on grade, so we don't have any heaving issues. And in order to use the local concrete, without paying for dyeing the batch, an entire batch, which is kind of expensive, we're going to use the local concrete. And this is roughly the color of the local concrete. The thing that colors concrete the most is the cement that's in it. And so we'll be using whatever cement is at the plant at the time that we're getting our concrete. As they trowel this surface, and because the color of the concrete comes mostly from the cement, not from the aggregate, we're going to be using a higher cement ratio in this concrete. So we're going to be using a 4,000 PSI mix. And as they trowel this, that cement will rise to the surface, and that will give us a really hard, durable surface at the top, which of course we're going to seal and wax to get the finish that we want. But that's a nice industrial connection back to this sort of barn. Makes the barn reference, gives us a nice durable surface upon which to build. Now the second reference point for barns that we talked about on the exterior was a more planar surface, and we talked about this in the model last time. We're referencing back to the existing siding on the house here, which is a hardy plank, a white hardy plank that was drawn from this grove of fallen birches that was on the site before we built here, and equally from the amount of snow that we get here. The ground is covered by snow about 6 months out of the year, so white is a good choice. There's also a lot of reference to Maine farmhouses, white farmhouses. Now the difference between the main house siding and the siding that we're using on this project is that I want to go to a larger scale here. So to reference barn, we're going to go to a larger plank, about a 1 foot plank, which means we'll take the hardy panel and we'll rip it down into roughly 6-inch sections, and then we'll use that as boarding on the building. The third reference to barn here in Maine, many barns were, and actually farmhouses were roofed in a galvalume roofing. This is a really economical material. It lasts 50 plus years, so it's a great roof. It sheds snow and really durable, and it also creates this really taut plane on the roof surface, which I like. So there's these industrial references connecting also back to rural Maine, agricultural Maine, but also to the barn form itself. Now we can start taking this material, and I could picture it repurposing this in the sort of wood storage area as a really durable surface that's rot resistant. It will stand up to the abuse that stacking logs in there will take. So I like this. We can start taking the roof material and start cladding some of these alcoves in that. That's kind of a nice thing. Then we can start connecting back to a sort of metal, more industrial commercial feel in some of the sliding window systems here that will make up the entry, that will make up these far windows, these slot windows on the back side. So we have this all this sort of subtle contrast here. Can you see where some of these inspirational images start to connect back here? So I have these subtle contrasts, gray tones. Now, as I think about barns, and as we move into the interior material palette, we'll set some of these aside, we have this beautiful concrete floor. As I think about barns and I think about this idea of contrast, I think about exposed wood planks, things that will be warm. So this is the warm to the cool. And if we think about using a wood plank system or a tongue and groove system, I also think about maybe using a veneered plywood. And it makes me want to use a local wood, such as, like a hemlock or a fir or something like that, spruce. But it's hard to get veneered plywood that way, and actually I don't love the tones of those. So I thought in digging through my sort of wood sample collection and just looking at the tonal contrast and the colors that I really gravitated toward. Fir, Douglas fir, seemed to be, first of all, it's a readily available plywood, so I can get veneer plywood relatively inexpensively and easily. It's a good use of the material. A veneered plywood makes use of, for the core, sort of waste wood, aligns all the fibers. It's very efficient structurally. And fir, if we got a vertical grain fir, which is what this is, the very fine line work, it's a great use of that material. When you come up with a veneer plywood, you actually just take a very fine layer, thin layer of this fir and veneer it onto as the top layer of the plywood. And so I'm thinking of that as a real kind of economical reference to the barn without having to do individual planks and all the labor that would take. This will go in large sheets. Maybe it's sheets that correlate with the exterior siding dimension. And those plywood sheets would actually be applied only up to the loft level. Now, since this last model version, we had decided to remove the timber bents as a way to save money, economize a little bit, but also because it was feeling like it was a lot of structure in a small space. So now I'm thinking that this wood can start to take the place of that. And as I start to connect it back to some of these Pinterest images, this framing image in particular, this makes me think that we could do exposed framing on these loft areas and clad it in this veneer plywood. And that becomes the sort of proxy for the timber frame. So we have some expression of exposed framing that a barn would have, but we've done it in a more economical way. Now, when we're talking about contrasts on the interior, we have this idea about contrast, and I think about this wood wainscoting that maybe comes up to this sort of loft level, the floor loft level. We still have the entire ceiling surface to address. And one of the things that I thought was it could be nice to have that ceiling surface be a lighter white color. And that would allow our new skylight, which we have now in the ridge here, that's washing this entire interior surface with great natural light. That would allow a white surface on the ceiling would allow the light to be reflected all around. And the light that we get from these gable end windows equally would bounce in and around. That provides a sort of light cap to the space, which is a contrasting wood color. And the wood in itself then contrasts with the floor color, the gray of the floor color. And what I like about this is when I started thinking about these contrasts and how I might use the space in the winter, if you picture my studio space, which sits on one end of this, and the practice space, which sits on the other end, clad in a sort of wood, veneered plywood sort of wall surface. In the winter, I can picture sort of being really nice and feeling nice and sheltered in this space. That feels like a more cozy thing. And then up above, it's still light. We have the contrast of the white wallboard and the white ceiling here and the skylight that's letting light in. I could also picture in the winter that we're completely closing this off and this becomes this sort of nook where I really sort of hunker down. And the warmth of the wood provides really kind of a nice sheltering space inside. So all these things start to suggest, that we're sort of on the right track. We're expressing these materials and systems for their inherent beauty. The plywood, we're expressing the joinery between the plywood or how it's fastened to the wall. We're expressing the concrete's natural beauty and the idea that a higher cement ratio gives its color. We're connecting it back to this concept of, the sort of warm interior, the rougher exterior, the sort of more bark-like exterior. And then I start making these other connections to, well, what about the lighting? Maybe the lighting can also be expressed as these sort of natural, for its own beauty. And that, you can actually see how the wiring gets to this fixture. This is about an $11 fixture made by Stoneco. It's a lamp holder meant for exterior use, very economical. But we can start looking at, the back plates. Maybe the thing that gives its detail are the lamp itself, this luminaire here, whatever that is, whether it's incandescent or it's something else, it's LED. And then the back plate, these things which make the connections, which make it code compliant, are actually the thing that provides the decoration in the space. Really like that, connects it back to a utilitarian feel, but it's also fits into the budget nicely. It's a great way of providing simple level of detail for not a lot of money. As you were going through this process and selecting materials for yourself, one of the things that I found was Room and Board, they have these great Parsons tables that they make, metal frame, wood top, or granite top, that kind of thing. But in order to make those material decisions, they offer these great little swatches. So if you don't have access to some of these materials, what you can do is go onto a fine furnishing site like Room and Board and order these sample swatches at no cost. You can see this maple with a shell stain, like that could be a really beautiful in a monochromatic color palette here. That would be really great. But they show, different woods with different stains. They have, powder coated MDF. They even have sort of plank things if you want to look at this as an interior material palette. There's a nice cherry, the butcher block. They have all of these different samples, steel, gray glass, to give you an idea of what these materials, how they play together. And that's really what this takes, is to get these materials in the same room, get your inspiration boards in the same room, and start overlaying things, play with things. Could we use this as a curtain inside? What else could we do? Could we do sort of, a etched glass panel inside? That could be light. And once you get these things together, sitting together, it really can help to inspire additional ideas. I think in the future videos, we're going to walk through how these materials actually come together, what their joints look like, how the lighting plan evolves from the simple ideas that we just talked about. And the next steps here are groundbreaking, so I'm going to be bringing you up to speed on that, hopefully in the next week or so, and we'll go on from there. Thanks for watching.